Welcome to day 60 of my art development series. Another week finished. So if this is your first time here, my name is Andrew Loren, and I'm doing a series where I'm recording my daily art practice and kind of showing how I think about practicing art and how I think about growing as an artist. And so right now I'm in the middle of a sequence where I'm doing 12 days of figure drawing. So I started on around December 13th, and the idea is to finish on the 25th and do a figure drawing every day. Today's figure is kind of interesting. So I'm continuing to use references from the pose archives, which if you go back a few videos, you can hear me kind of talk about, give some details there. So for right now, I'll kind of skip it, but the resources are all linked below in the description associated with this video. But this is kind of an interesting pose because if you look at yesterday's video or day 59 of my practice, I actually did the exact same pose, but this was with a male model. So one of the really great things about this resource is that they often have a male and female version of the exact same pose. So it's kind of interesting because you can see, looking at, the previous drawing and this drawing, kind of compare and contrast some of the differences between drawing male figure and female figure, which generally come down to like things about the weight of the figure, generally like with respect to the width, but even the length is a little bit different generally from female figures to male figures. And the anatomy even slightly shifts, like particularly around the waist area. I mean, the underlying muscles and skeletal structure is the exact same, but kind of the way that the anatomy sits on the figure. So for example, like the latissimus dorsi muscles, that's this like really large back muscle that kind of, has this nice curvature that comes around the side of the figure, is generally like more pronounced on male figures than it is on female figures. Of course, if you have like a female bodybuilder, then, these kinds of things can change, but this is just generally the appearance of these types of muscles in the references that we're looking at. So overall, just to quickly comment on this drawing, I think it was like a fairly successful drawing in terms of accomplishing what I want to accomplish. So something I talk about often is that the enlightened artist knows that when they're doing their daily practice, the goal is not necessarily to create the perfect drawing. Rather, what you're really trying to do is practice something. This is not a drawing that's meant to go into a museum. This is not a drawing that's meant to go, even on Instagram, let's say. This is a drawing that is about me trying to learn something about the process of drawing. And so what I'm focused on in this 12 days of figures is things like understanding the proportions better, kind of like internalizing them within my hand to the point where less and less I have to think about them. So I'll still check things with measurements, always, you'll never fully get away from this idea of like having to measure and understand how things sit in the figure, but you can drastically reduce the amount of time that you spend measuring as opposed to just like kind of drawing from instinct. So that's kind of one of the things that I'm really looking at is this idea of proportion. Then I also want to practice the anatomy and understand how the anatomy sits on the body. And then I'm also looking at things like the gesture of the pose, trying to understand the gesture of the pose, and also a little bit about the posing. And so for the rest of the video, I kind of want to do something interesting. So the total time lapse is about 10 minutes, and we've already played about 3.5, 4 minutes of it. What I'd like to do for the rest of it is actually to try and do like a little bit of a voiceover and just kind of talk about what I'm doing. So once I finish here, I'll let that play out, and we can kind of experiment with that type of setup for the video. So let me know if you find that helpful, and if so, I can kind of continue to do something similar or different versions of that in the future. But I think that's everything. So hopefully these ideas and this drawing today has motivated you. Actually, it's a great motivation. You should check out the Pose Archives Instagram page, and I guarantee you will come across at least one pose where you're like, oh wow, this is cool, I should probably draw this today. And that can motivate you to draw today if you haven't already started. So I think that's everything, and I'll see you on Monday for day 61. Alright, so I'm playing back this time-lapse, and I'll be commenting a little bit on some of my process. So for those who haven't seen my full process, my approach to drawing figures is to first do kind of a 2D lay-in, where I just trace around the outside of the figure. I might add like a little bit of internal detail, in particular, kind of trying to demarcate where the head is and orient the head, but in general I start by just kind of getting a 2D lay-in. And this helps me understand a little bit better the proportion of the figure and how it's going to sit on the page.
And then after that is when I kind of start to go in and try and build up some of these 3D forms. So what I'm working on right now is kind of adding some detail around the leg, and also you can see like on the calf muscle, I had kind of put this indication that it's a round shape by adding this kind of curved line to try and bring out some of the three-dimensionality. And likewise right now as I work on, you know, within the figure actually, you actually have the underwear or the thong that can be used here to kind of indicate a little bit better the form that exists on the figure. So I'm kind of trying to add some of that roundness right here to the glutes and the butt and try and add some of that three-dimensionality aspect. As I was kind of doing this figure, I also started writing down the time that I was at, just to try and give a better sense of how long the drawing has been going on. So right now we're about 45 minutes in, and you can see that the figure is starting to take shape. There's still a lot of areas that need to be tightened up and kind of redefined, but in general, they're taking shape a little bit. What I was just working on right there across the body was trying to understand a little bit better this idea of the stretch and the pinch. And if you watch the previous video where I talk about this figure, but with the male pose, I go into detail about this idea of the stretch and this pinch. I think it's like really valuable, especially for creating some realism and adding some like real weight to your figures. So if you're curious about that, I recommend you check out day 59. At this point, I actually added a little bit of value into the legs. When there's a piece of my drawing that, this is just kind of like a stylistic approach, but when there's a piece of my drawing that I kind of want to push into shadow or push into the background, I'll just kind of add a value through it. And this, ironically, in this kind of pose, actually draws attention away from the legs and into the figure, closer to the face and the torso. One thing that I like to do whenever I get stuck on a figure drawing, really any drawing that's about the face or the body, is go back in and kind of redefine the center lines. And when I do this, it kind of helps me reorient where the figure is in space, and also helps me pick out details that can either build off of that center line or re-emphasize it. Here I'm actually fixing the proportions of the lower leg. I noticed that it was a little bit off, the positioning of the knee, and so I'm going back in and correcting it. For me, drawings are often this kind of pushing and pulling where I have a certain proportionality or a certain piece of the drawing set, and then I have to go in and change it. And for me, it's totally okay, this process of drawing and redrawing. As I get into the final stages of this painting, my goal is to kind of better define shapes. In areas where I like the dark lines, or I think there should be dark lines, I go in and try and define them as sharply and as crisply as possible, just to give, again, this figure this real weight of sitting in space and feeling like a completed figure or a completed drawing. Another aspect that can give weight to your figure in these quick little sketches is to add the shadows, which can kind of communicate where the figure is sitting in space and help ground it into that space.